Creed in 1 Corinthians 15 is the only place in ancient literature where it is claimed that Jesus appeared to 500 people at once. The Gospels don't corroborate it. No secular historian mentions it. And to me, that raises a yellow flag. If this really happened, why doesn't anyone else talk about it? You'd think the apostles would cite this as evidence wherever they went. As the atheist Michael Martin says, one must conclude that it is extremely unlikely that this incident really occurred, and that this therefore indirectly cast doubt on Paul as a reliable source. That remark bothered Habermas. Well, it's just plain silliness to say this cast doubt on Paul, he replied, sounding both astonished and annoyed that someone would make that claim. I mean, give me a break. First, even though it's only reported in one source, it just so happens to be the earliest and best authenticated passage of all. That counts for something. Second, Paul apparently had some proximity to these people, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Paul either knew some of these people or was told by someone who knew them that they were still walking around and willing to be interviewed. Now, stop and think about it. You would never include this phrase unless you were absolutely confident that these folks would confirm that they really did see Jesus alive. I mean, Paul was virtually inviting people to check it out for themselves. He wouldn't have said this if he didn't know they'd back him up. Third, when you have only one source, you can ask, why aren't there more? But you can't say this one source is crummy on the grounds that someone else didn't pick up on it. You can't downgrade this one source that way. So this doesn't cast any doubt on Paul at all. Believe me, Martin would love to be able to do that, but he can't do it legitimately. This is an example of how some critics want it both ways. Generally, they denigrate the gospel resurrection accounts in favor of Paul, since he is taken as the chief authority. But on this issue, they're questioning Paul for the sake of texts that they don't trust as much in the first place. What does this say about their methodology? Look, I'd love to have 5 sources for this. I don't. But I do have one excellent source, a creed that's so good that German historian Hans von Koppenhausen says this account meets all the demands of historical reliability that could possibly be made of such a text. Besides, you don't need to rely on the reference of the 500 to make the case for the resurrection. Usually I don't even use it. Still, there was another aspect of the creed that weighed on me. It says Jesus appeared first to Peter, whereas John said he appeared first to Mary Magdalene. In fact, the creed doesn't mention any women, even though they're prominently featured in the gospel accounts. Don't these contradictions hurt its credibility? I asked. No. First of all, look at the creed carefully. It doesn't say Jesus appeared first to Peter. All it does is put Peter's name first on the list. And since women were not considered competent as witnesses in first-century Jewish culture, it's not surprising that they're not mentioned here. In the first-century scheme of things, their testimony wouldn't carry any weight. So placing Peter first could indicate logical priority rather than temporal priority. The creed's credibility remains intact. You've raised some questions, but wouldn't you concede that they don't undermine the persuasive evidence that the creed is early, that it's free from legendary contamination, that it's unambiguous and specific, and that it's ultimately rooted in eyewitness accounts? William Lane Craig, the resurrection expert, said that the late Wolfhart Pannenberg, perhaps the greatest systematic theologian in the world, rocked modern skeptical German theology by building his entire theology precisely on the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus as supplied in Paul's list of appearances.